The most important library ever built wasn't made from stone. It was made from stories. Long before anything was written down, people held onto what they knew about the world inside the tales they told. So there's a question here. What if those old myths, those legends, they're actually holding precise memories of the planet's past, preserving changes in the environment in a way that scrolls, tablets, they often couldn't. By the end of this, you might see mythology differently, not just as folklore, but as a kind of science, a resilient, sophisticated form of ecological science. We're going to look at how a single story, a flood story that shows up everywhere, might point back to a real prehistoric disaster, and how a legend about an endless winter could be encoding a climate shift that lasted for centuries. There's a forgotten truth about our world, and it's waiting inside the oldest story you've ever heard. You have a circle of people around a fire, a storyteller speaking. And the story carries more than a plot. It carries the weight of seasons, the names of plants you can eat, the paths animals take, the signs of a storm coming. That's the heart of an oral tradition. It's not a library you go to. It's a living archive that comes to you, passed from breath to breathe, generation to generation. In that moment, the story is a tool for survival, encoded with everything a community needs to know about its home. Now, a physical record, a clay tablet with markings, a parchment scroll with careful script. These are monumental things, but they're static. They can be shattered in a conquest, faded by time, locked away in a language no one speaks. They capture a single moment, frozen. An oral legend is different. It's dynamic, it breathes, it lives in the community's relationship with the land. The philosopher David Abram talks about this, a participatory relationship with the natural world. Knowledge isn't just information in a mind, it's sensory. It's the taste of a specific berry, the sound of a river in a certain season, the feeling of the wind shifting. The story is the container for that deep, embodied knowing. But how does a story preserve complex information across hundreds of years without a single written note? The answer is in its design. These narratives were engineered for memory. They used rhythmic patterns of language, a steady, poetic meter that makes words easier to recall. They used mnemonic devices, recurring characters, a fixed sequence of events. These act as mental hooks. Think of the Iliad, its formulaic phrases, its repetitive scenes. That wasn't a lack of creativity, it was a memory palace. A rigid framework, and on that framework, an immense amount of cultural and environmental data could be hung and retrieved reliably, and this is where the true genius shows itself. Because it was a living system, it could adapt. If a river changed its course over a century, the legend about the journey to a sacred mountain might adjust its landmarks. If a tree crucial for toolmaking became scarce, the story about the first spear might start to emphasize a different wood. The narrative could evolve to mirror the new reality of the environment. A written record fixed in ink at a specific date can't do that. It can only tell you what was. An oral legend retold around 1,000 fires can tell you what was. What is, and it can offer a map for what might be. That's the first key principle. These stories were never just about the past. They were, and are, a continuous, breathing dialogue with a changing world. That cognitive map is built with characters, not coordinates. In these old stories, the landscape is alive. A mountain isn't just a landmark, it's a sleeping giant. A river isn't just water, it's a temperamental god. That's the first idea. The landscape embodied in myth. Joseph Campbell called myth a secret opening. A way for cosmic energies to pour into human culture, which is a beautiful way to put it. These stories are how the living world entered the human imagination. And by doing that, they preserved crucial knowledge. Think about it practically. A dry instruction is easy to forget. Don't build on the floodplain. but a vivid legend about a river god whose fury once drowned a whole village when he was disrespected. That sticks, that gets retold. That story isn't just about a flood. It's a memory of a flood, encoded in a character's emotion. The god's anger becomes a metaphor for the rising water. His eventual calm means it's safe to return, or a tale about the earth goddess turning her back, causing the crops to wither. That could be a record of a multi-year drought. Her departure isn't a whimsical plot point. It's a chronicle of environmental change. You see this etched into place names. That's toponymy. A valley isn't just Green Valley. It's called Bone Valley. That name tells a story of hardship. A time when game disappeared. A canyon isn't just Deep Canyon. It's Thirsty Canyon. That name is a permanent, spoken warning about the lack of water. These names are the anchors of the oral map. They're the chapter headings in a community's environmental record. Maybe the deepest example is from Aboriginal Australian cultures. Their concept of songlines. A songline is an intricate oral map, but it's sung. It's a narrative that describes a journey across the land, and within that song are precise directions. The location of a hidden waterhole, the type of soil over the next ridge, the behavior of animals in that area. The song doesn't just describe the landscape. It is the landscape translated into melody and story. To know the song is to know how to survive, how to navigate vast, unforgiving terrain. The environmental data isn't abstract. It's experiential, it's emotional. It's woven into the identity of the people and the characters in their world. This ensured the knowledge wasn't just preserved. It was cherished, repeated, kept relevant with every new telling. The land and its story became the same thing. The second idea here is about time. A written record might just list the years of a drought, one year after another, but a legend changes that. It takes a century of slow drying and turns it into one powerful image, the Great Thirst or a hero crossing a burned land. That's temporal compression. The slow changes of the earth get turned into a story on a human scale. A legend that covers 3 generations isn't really about 3 people. It's about the length of a human memory, the time it takes for a whole community to see a change and recognize it as a new pattern. Climate historians, Brian Fagan for example, they point out how societies remember megadroughts, not as a list of dry years in a book, but as whole eras, a time when the old ways stopped working, when the world seemed to turn against them. These become the dark ages in a people's story. The long winter, the endless summer, and this is where the symbolic encoding happens. A sacred spring that dies in a myth isn't just a story point. It can be a record of a water table dropping. A petrified forest where a hero fights a stone giant might stand for a desert advancing. A great beast that sleeps for 1,000 years could be a memory of a volcano being quiet. The symbol carries the environmental truth inside a story. It makes something too slow to see suddenly feel vivid, memorable. You see this very clearly in some Native American traditions. Stories about beings like the water panther or the underwater lynx. These aren't just monsters. Scholars looking at these stories think they might be metaphorical memories of huge geological change. From after the last ice age, when the glaciers pulled back, when huge lakes formed and then drained, when the shape of the land and the flow of water were in total upheaval. A creature that controls the depths, that makes springs appear or disappear, that reshapes the shore. That's a powerful way to encode the behavior of a wild, changing water system after the ice. It turns a complex, scary process of environmental change into a character, something with motives and actions, something a community can understand and talk about and pass on. A simple list of facts about ice sheets receding doesn't have that power. It doesn't tell you how to feel about the change. It doesn't put the knowledge inside a framework of meaning. But a story about a great spirit of the ice moving north, leaving behind new lakes and strange rivers, It makes the slow catastrophe of climate shift something you can grasp. It gives you a story to explain why the world you know isn't the world your ancestors talked about. This kind of encoding makes sure the knowledge survives. Not as cold data, but as a living part of who a people are. The land's history and the people's story become the same thing. There's a story that's ancient. A story about a great flood. It's in the epic of Gilgamesh, in the story of Noah, in myths from the Maya, from the Greeks, from indigenous cultures everywhere. The details change, but the core is the same. A flood that cleans the world. That's not a coincidence. The question isn't whether one boat held every animal. It's whether this could be a collective memory, a story passed down for thousands of years, holding the trauma of a real, catastrophic change. This isn't about theology. It's about oral history, how one powerful story can become a container for planetary memory. Geologists and archaeologists have pointed to something. Around the end of the last ice age, about 12,000 years ago, the seas rose fast, glaciers melted, coastlines moved back, sometimes miles, but it wasn't always slow. There's evidence for catastrophic floods. One theory is about the Black Sea. It was a big freshwater lake, then the rising Mediterranean may have broken through. Turned its saltwater in an instant. For any communities living on those low, fertile shores, it would have been unimaginable. A wall of water redrawing their world in a lifetime. Now listen to the flood myths again, not as scripture, as survival guides. The specific, repeating parts start to make sense. The instruction to build a substantial boat. That's not just a plot point, it's a strategy for rapid coastal flooding, sending out birds, a raven, a dove to find land. That's a practical method. For scouting a drowned world from the safety of your ark, the boat grounding on a high mountain, that's not just poetry, it's a crucial geographical detail. It tells you where to go, head for the high ground. These stories encode a step-by-step guide for surviving a world-changing flood. Compare that to the earliest written flood records. They exist, but they're fragmented, local to one river valley, one king's reign. A clay tablet might record a bad flood on the Tigris, but it stands alone. It doesn't connect to a flood on the other side of the world. Oral myths passed across generations and continents create that connection through story. They preserve the scale of the event in a way isolated records can't. There's the Maori legend of the Great Canoe Takitimu. It tells of ancestors who sailed to New Zealand to escape a rising ocean in their homeland. That story, passed down orally for centuries, lines up with what we know of Pacific sea level changes. It's not a list of dates and depths. It's the memory of a people, of a journey made necessary by a changing planet, kept alive in the hull of a legendary canoe. It shows the resilience of the oral record. One powerful story, repeated and refined over millennia, can preserve the memory of a planetary event more effectively than scattered, perishable written accounts. The flood myth isn't just a tale of punishment or renewal. It might be humanity's first global climate report, a warning from our deepest past, written not in ink but in the structure of the stories we can't seem to forget. The story is performed in the place it describes. That's the third principle, the feedback loop between performance and place. You have a community gathering near a canyon. The storyteller tells the creation myth. The myth talks about a great crack in the earth made by a hero's spear, and as the words are spoken, the people aren't just hearing it. They're looking at the canyon, they're feeling it there. The story and the landscape become one thing, one experience. The anthropologist Keith Basso saw this with the Western Apache. He wrote that wisdom sits in places. For them, places aren't just scenery, they're participants in moral life, in historical life. A rocky outcrop isn't just a rock. It's a reminder of a story about resilience. A spring isn't just water, it's a character in a legend about generosity. Every time the story is told there, the connection gets renewed. The knowledge isn't just recalled, it's felt again, sensorially, emotionally, and this performance creates a check against environmental drift. Think of it as a system of verification. If the story describes a bubbling, plentiful spring, but the community arrives for the ceremony and finds it dry, then there's a discrepancy. A powerful one. The story hasn't changed, but the place has. That moment forces a conversation, an interpretation. Maybe the story gets altered slightly next time. A new line might be added about a time the spring slept, or the dryness itself becomes part of the narrative. A new chapter in the relationship between the people and that place. It's a living feedback loop. A scroll in a temple vault can't do that. It's fixed. It can't look at a dry spring and question itself. But an oral tradition performed in place constantly compares its map to the actual territory. It allows for self-correction. That's the role of pilgrimage, of seasonal ceremony. It's not just tradition for its own sake. It's active ecological maintenance. Take the Kitch Maya and the Popol Vuh, their creation story. For generations, its recitation was tied to specific sacred landscapes. The story of the hero twins going into the underworld was connected to actual caves. The narrative of mountain gods was linked to real peaks. By performing the myth there, they weren't just honoring gods. They were reinforcing a map, a complex mytho-geographical map of their entire territory. They were walking their history, their cosmology, their environmental knowledge all at once. Each step on the pilgrimage, each recitation at a shrine, renewed the understanding of where resources were, where boundaries lay, how the spiritual and physical worlds connected. This principle shows the genius of oral tradition for contextual relevance. It's not a fragile, static record. It's a resilient, adaptive dialogue. The story listens to the land, and the community listens to the story. Over centuries, this loop keeps the knowledge useful. It keeps it true, not in a literal, unchanging sense, but in a practical, living sense. The narrative bends. It bends to accommodate the shifts of the earth. So the wisdom of the past never gets disconnected from the reality of the present. It's a conversation across time, held in the space between a spoken word and a sacred stone. The great library at Alexandria burned. Flames took it, one of the ancient world's great collections of knowledge gone to smoke and ash. It's a symbol, of course. It shows the fragility, a centralized archive, one fire, one conquest, one disaster. Centuries of records can just vanish. That story is about more than a library. It's about a vulnerability. Physical records are fixed in place. They're hostages to their own form. Papyrus crumbles, ink fades, clay tablets shatter. Even the best-preserved scroll is in a race, a slow race against decay. The technical challenge was immense. Ancient inks were often acidic. They'd eat the parchment they marked. Humidity warped bindings. Bookworms, the actual insect, could tunnel through a library's wisdom. Page by page, these records were static objects in a dynamic, destructive world. Their survival was never a guarantee, but there's a deeper loss, one that happens even if the object survives. It's the loss of context, the loss of the key. To interpret what you're reading, imagine a clay tablet. It lists 10 years of low harvests in precise cuneiform. That's data, valuable data, but what does it tell you? It doesn't tell you how the community felt. It doesn't hold the songs they sang for rain. It doesn't describe the new foraging techniques they invented. It doesn't have the story of the elder who saw the drought as a sign that the earth needed rest, all that lived knowledge, the cultural, emotional, practical response. It exists outside the written record. The tablet holds the fact, but the legend holds the meaning. This extends to language. A script can become a mystery. Linear B, the script of the Mycenaeans, it was unreadable for centuries after they fell. The written record was there but silent, its secrets locked away. Because the living thread of spoken language had been cut, an oral tradition faces a different thing. Its language evolves with the people, the core narrative of a flood, a long winter. The details might shift over generations, the hero's name might change, but the fundamental lesson at its heart, the warning about building near the river. The memory of a species that disappeared, that core has a stubborn way of persisting. It's preserved because it remains useful. It retains its relevance. To survival, a written record is a snapshot, a single perspective frozen in time. An oral legend is a river. It flows, it changes course, it takes in new tributaries of experience. But it keeps moving, and it keeps carrying the essential nutrients, the knowledge forward. The fire at Alexandria showed how easily a repository can be destroyed. But it also highlights, by contrast, the resilience of a different system, where the library isn't a building, it's the community itself, where the books aren't on shelves. They're in the breath and memory of every storyteller, in the landscape they describe, in the collective heart of the people who keep the story alive. The story doesn't end with the person who tells it. It waits for the next voice. That's the fourth principle, calibration across generations through cycles of stories. A saga isn't a book you close, it's a living heirloom. Each elder who holds it becomes an editor. They don't just repeat the words they heard, they weave in the winters they've felt. The droughts they've lived through, the new patterns they've seen on the land. Oral historians call this generational depth. A story's truth isn't fixed at its origin. It's refined across lifetimes. Each generation acts as a calibrator. They compare the old narrative against the new reality of their world, and then adjust the tale just slightly to keep the map accurate. So a cycle of stories about a legendary long winter isn't just a memory of one event. It's a template. When a new, severe cooling comes, the storytellers don't invent a brand new myth. They add a new chapter to the old one. They might describe the frost biting deeper, or name a new hero who learned to hunt a different animal. The old legend provides the framework. The new experience provides the updated detail. Layer upon layer, century upon century, it creates a narrative palimpsest, like a manuscript where older writing shows through beneath the new. A single story can hold the memory of multiple climate shifts, all folded into one coherent epic. In some cultures, this wasn't left to chance. Specific lineages or guilds were entrusted with the task. The Griots of West Africa, the Sinchai of Ireland, they were more than entertainers. They were the living historians, the keepers of environmental precedent. Their training was rigorous. Their memory was the community's database. Their role was to maintain the narrative's core integrity while letting its details breathe. To evolve with the times, this made the calibration deliberate, informed, not a game of telephone, but a disciplined process of verification across generations. A powerful example is in the Icelandic sagas. These family histories, passed down orally before being written, are filled with what seem like throwaway details. Precise descriptions of sea ice, noting which fjords were choked with it in a particular year, vivid accounts of volcanic eruptions, the color of the sky, the depth of the ash fall. For a long time, these were read as literary flourishes, just atmosphere to set a mood, but then geologists started to look, and they found a startling alignment. The saga descriptions of extreme sea ice matched the known periods of the Little Ice Age. The recorded eruptions correlated with layers of tephra in the soil. The stories weren't just setting a scene, they were embedding calibrated environmental reports into the family narrative. A grandfather's memory of a hard winter became a data point. A great-uncle's tale of a fiery mountain became a timestamp, each generation telling the saga of their ancestors, subtly updated this living record with their own observations. This process creates something a single authored chronicle cannot, a continuously verified account. A written chronicle is a statement. It says, "This is what happened as I saw it." An oral cycle is a conversation. It asks, does this still match what you see? And if not, let us refine it together. the record becomes a collaborative project across centuries. It's not stored in a vault, it's carried in the collective consciousness, and it's constantly being checked against the only thing that truly matters. The living, changing earth outside the door, the story remains, but its truth is always being renewed. The Pacific is huge, it's a water desert, thousands of miles. To cross something like that, a map isn't enough. You need a song. For the Polynesian voyagers, their library wasn't on land, it was in the night sky. In the swell of the sea, in the rhythm of a chant, their oral traditions did something incredible. They settled islands across an ocean bigger than all the continents. They did it deliberately, and they did it again and again. No compasses, no sextants, they used stories. This might be the purest form of an oral legend. A living environmental database. The knowledge wasn't in a logbook. It was encoded in what they called the star paths, and these weren't just constellations for steering. They were narratives. A star line, like the one for Maui, was a sequence in a longer chant. That chant gave you the star's rising point, but it also told you the seasonal wind that came with it. The type of cloud near that horizon when land was close, the specific seabirds that nested on the islands under those stars, how far out to sea they'd fly to fish. One navigational chant wove it all together: astronomy, meteorology, ornithology, oceanography, one seamless story. The modern Hawaiian navigator Nainoa Thompson talks about this. He calls it a relational knowledge. You don't just look at a star, you have a relationship with it. You know its story, its companions in the sky, its effect on the world below. Then there were the wave pilots. They could read the ocean's subtle patterns. They learned through chants that described the feel of swells, how they'd refract around unseen islands hundreds of miles away. And these chants were dynamic. If a current shifted over generations, the chant could be adjusted. The new pattern was woven into the narrative, calibrated by the latest voyagers. This was knowledge in a perpetual conversation with the environment. Now think about a written alternative, a captain's log from one voyage. It might record on a specific date, steering by a certain star and seeing a certain bird. It's a snapshot, a single data point, and it's fragile. The book can be lost, the ink can run, but more than that, that log doesn't hold the deeper pattern. It doesn't teach you the relationship. It doesn't tell you that the bird's appearance changes with the monsoon cycle, and that cycle is tied to the star's position earlier in the season. A written record isolates facts. The oral tradition preserves the system. The Polynesian Wayfinder didn't carry charts, they carried genealogies, chants linking them back to ancestors who made the journey before. Reciting those chants wasn't just honoring family, it was downloading a multidimensional map, a map linking the celestial, the oceanic, and the terrestrial into one navigable story. This is oral tradition at its highest capacity. It wasn't just preserving a memory of environmental change. It was actively using a narrative framework to model a complex, living system. In real time, the story was the interface. Through it, a human mind could hold a staggering amount of ecological data, interact with it, data that was essential not for curiosity, but for survival. To follow the story was to find your way home across the trackless sea. It was to understand your place within a moving, breathing world. We think of a monster in a swamp. That stays. A footnote about wetland hazards doesn't. That's the fifth principle, emotional salience, a story's raw power to grip memory. Cognitive psychology points to it. Information wrapped in a narrative, especially one with feeling, is stickier. We're wired for stories. A list of facts about a dangerous coastline can blur. But a legend about a sea serpent that pulls down the unwary, that creates an anchor, a vivid, emotional anchor for the knowledge. The warning about the riptides becomes inseparable from the thrilling fear of the tale. That's the von Restorff effect, the isolation effect. A distinctive, emotionally resonant item stands out against ordinary information. It's remembered. For oral traditions, this wasn't a bonus, it was the design. Survival lessons weren't bullet points, they were encoded in the drama of a hero's failure. The tragedy of a village that ignored an omen, the wonder of a spirit that healed the land. The emotional charge wasn't just for entertainment, it was the glue. The glue that made essential knowledge unforgettable, and this glue was strengthened by rhythm and sound, the multi-sensory encoding of memory. Many oral traditions didn't just tell stories. They sang them, chanted them, danced them. Adding melody and movement creates more neural pathways for recall. Think of a song from your childhood. It can surface, lyrics intact, decades later. That's the power at play. An environmental map set to music is a map that lives in your bones. There's a profound example, the Sami Yoik, a traditional song form of the indigenous people of Northern Europe. A yoik is not a song about a person or a place or a reindeer. It is that person, that place, that animal. It's a poetic, melodic portrait. A yoik for a valley might capture the sound of the wind through its pines, the pattern of the lichen on the rocks, the feeling of the cold air. It's a sensory and emotional impression, sung. To know the yoik of a place is to carry its essence with you. Its weather patterns, its resources, its dangers are all embedded in that resonant melody. The knowledge becomes intimate, unforgettable. It has a stickiness a written description in a logbook could never achieve. Now contrast that with an early written agricultural manual. It might list the best phases of the moon for planting crops. It's valuable data, but it exists in a cognitive vacuum. It's not tied to the story of the moon goddess who blesses the seeds. It's not chanted during a spring festival where the community feels the soil and smells the coming rain. The written fact is inert. The sung legend is alive. It connects the practical action to a web of meaning, emotion, and community experience. This emotional and sensory encoding gave oral knowledge a formidable advantage. It ensured the most critical information: where the water was safe, which berries were poisonous. How to predict the storm wasn't just known, it was felt. And what is felt deeply is what is remembered across a lifetime and passed on with conviction to the next generation waiting by the fire. These oral systems, they weren't perfect logs. They were human, and that humanity left its own mark on the record, a kind of bias. The same adaptability that gave them strength could also distort things over time. Folklorists call it communal recreation. Every telling is a new creation, shaped by the teller, by the audience, by the moment, that kept stories alive, but it also meant the environmental signal could get layered over. A practical warning about a flood could become a myth about a god's anger. The actual memory of the water height might soften, turn into something more dramatic, more resonant. The truth was still there, but wrapped in thicker cloth, and the chain itself was fragile. If a line of storytellers broke from conflict, from sickness, from being forced to move, the knowledge could vanish in a generation. A buried tablet can be found later. A story unspoken is just gone. Its library burns without any smoke, and stories could be reshaped by agendas. A new leader might tweak a founding legend to justify a land claim. A cultural shift could turn a tale of bad weather into a story about moral failure. This record wasn't a sterile instrument. It was a living document, pressed and shaped by the people holding it. You see certain biases in what survived. Catastrophes, the sudden and spectacular, were remembered much more vividly than slow change. A legend holds the day the mountain exploded. It's less likely to hold the memory of a glacier creeping forward over a century or a lake turning acidic slowly. Events that hit human survival directly, a famine, a flood, those dominate. Events that change the ecosystem in subtler ways, like a shift in which insects pollinated the plants, often left no story. Take a volcano. The legend will remember the destruction. The darkness, the buried villages, the exodus, that's the human trauma etched in. but that same eruption over centuries would spread rich new soil across a whole region. That slower benefit, that quiet renewal, it rarely becomes an epic. It just becomes the background. The story holds the shock, not the slow gift. Seeing this doesn't weaken the idea. It sharpens it. It shows these legends preserve a specific kind of environmental knowledge, not a year-by-year scientific log, but a record of human-scale impact. They tell us how a community perceived a change, how they survived it, what they thought caused it, and what lesson they took from it. The fidelity isn't to the raw geophysical data. It's to the lived human experience of that data. They preserve the why it mattered with a clarity that scattered records often can't. They remind us an environmental change is never just a number. It's a story of loss, of adaptation, and sometimes of a truth that was waiting to be heard again. A creation myth explains more than how people began. It explains the relationship between the pine tree, the salmon, and the north wind. In these stories, they aren't just background, they're relatives. Characters in a family drama. That's the sixth principle, holistic integration. Oral traditions held an understanding of ecosystems as interconnected webs, long before the word ecology existed. The natural world wasn't a collection of resources to manage. It was a community of beings to relate to. Robin Wall Kimmerer writes about this. She calls it the grammar of animacy. A way of seeing where other beings, like sweetgrass or maples, are understood as persons. Not human persons, but persons with their own gifts and responsibilities. This worldview, carried in stories, creates a relationship of reciprocity. The legend says if you take, you must give thanks. If you care for the land, it will care for you. This isn't a vague spiritual idea. It's a precise conservation ethic encoded in narrative. If the story says the river is the blood of an ancestor, polluting it isn't just dirty. It's a profound offense, a rupture in the family, and the legend makes the consequence clear. You will suffer, the fish will disappear, the water will make you ill. The story enforces sustainable practice by giving moral agency to the non-human world. Now, an early written record from an ancient state, you might find a tax ledger. An inventory of timber cut or grain harvested. These are compartmentalized lists. They record a resource as a number, a quantity to be extracted. They don't explain that the tall pines on the hill hold the soil that feeds the spring that waters the field where the grain grows. The written record isolates, the oral legend connects. It preserves the relational context that makes an ecosystem function. A perfect example is the Haudenosaunee legend of the Three Sisters. It's a story about agriculture, but it's also a detailed manual of soil science and companion planting. The story personifies corn, beans, and squash as three loving siblings who thrive only together. Corn, the tall sister, provides a pole for the bean vines to climb. Beans, the nurturing sister, pull nitrogen from the air and fix it in the soil, fertilizing the corn. Squash, the sprawling sister, shades the ground with her broad leaves, keeping moisture in and weeds out. The story doesn't just state these botanical facts. It weaves them into a narrative of mutual aid and family duty. To hear the story is to understand why these three must be planted together. It encodes the entire symbiotic relationship in a form that's unforgettable. And it makes the practice sacred. It's not just a good farming technique. It's the right way to honor the sisterhood of the seeds. This is knowledge held not as data, but as a covenant. A promise to participate in the web of life in a way that sustains all its members. The story itself becomes the teacher of balance. 65,000 years. That's a length of time. It's more than 2,000 generations. It makes the pyramids feel recent. That's the scale of Aboriginal Australian civilization. The oldest continuous thread of human knowledge we have, and their dreamtime stories, their songlines, they're not just mythology, they're a living archive. A record of environmental observation on a scale no written record could match. These narratives reach back into the Pleistocene, when the world was a different shape. When giant creatures roamed, when coastlines were miles out from where they are now, the stories hold that world in memory. Archaeologists and scholars, Bruce Pascoe for example, point to the evidence inside them. In works like Dark Emu, he shows how these traditions encode detailed systems of land management, sophisticated systems, observed and refined over tens of thousands of years. This is our case study in ultra-long-term memory, a library written not on paper but in the land itself, in the rhythms of the stories that walk across it. So listen to the narratives with that in mind. Across the continent there are stories about creatures of immense size, beings that sound to us now like the megafauna of the ancient past. The Diprotodon, a wombat the size of a rhinoceros, or the giant kangaroo Procoptodon. In many Aboriginal traditions, these aren't presented as extinct animals from a forgotten age. They're remembered as ancestors, as creator beings from the dreaming. Their descriptions, their behaviors, the landscapes they inhabited, it's all preserved in the lore. These aren't fossil bones being interpreted. They're living memories passed down through an unbroken chain of telling. The stories place them in specific places, interacting with the land in specific ways. It's a window into an ecosystem that vanished millennia ago. Even more striking are the stories of geography that no longer exists. Across northern Australia, there are widespread legends about a time when you could walk to what is now New Guinea, when the sea was much lower. A vast plain connected the continents. These narratives describe the coastline as it was, not as it is. They tell of hunting grounds, freshwater springs that now lie beneath the Arafura Sea. And in the south, stories speak of a land bridge to Tasmania, a connection severed by rising waters roughly 12,000 years ago. The oral traditions retain the memory of that connected landscape. They remember the journey. For a written record to preserve such a detail, it would have to have been inscribed before the seas rose, and then survive intact for over 400 generations. The statistical impossibility shows the power of the oral system. It adapted. As the water rose, the story evolved, from a literal travel guide to a sacred memory of a lost world. But the core fact of the connection stayed embedded within it. The practical knowledge in these songlines is breathtaking in its precision. Take fire, stick farming. This wasn't wildfire, it was a deliberate, careful practice, controlled burning to manage the landscape. The stories and ceremonies dictated when and where to burn, which areas to create for fresh green shoots to attract game, which fire breaks to establish to protect sacred sites or biodiversity hotspots. This was a calendar and a manual all in one. It maintained the health of the country across centuries. The stories encoded the seasonal food calendars with similar detail. They don't just say berries are ripe in summer. They narrate the journey of a creator being, and in that journey point to the exact tree at the exact time when a certain fruit is sweetest, or when a particular root is most nutritious. They map the location of soaks and waterholes in arid regions with life-saving accuracy. A songline is a sung map. To follow its verses is to navigate from one vital resource to the next across hundreds of kilometers of desert. What this case argues is that oral tradition can preserve environmental baselines. It holds a memory of what the land was like before major changes. It offers a record of the changes themselves, and it maintains the wisdom for living within that system sustainably. This is a time span beyond any human-made written record. The oldest clay tablets are infants next to this lineage. These stories provide a window into deep ecological history. Not as a list of events, but as an experienced, felt relationship with a living continent. They remind us that some truths are too vast to be captured in marks on a page. They require a story that walks, a story that is sung into the land across 65,000 years, and in that song, the memory of the earth itself continues to breathe. The trail is the story. That's the seventh principle mnemonic geography. The physical world becomes a memory palace, but not a palace in the mind, one built from the land itself. Think of a ceremonial path. A pilgrim isn't just walking from one place to another. They're walking through a narrative. Every bend in the trail, every distinctive rock, every ancient tree is a chapter marker. A stopping point, a place where a specific part of the creation story gets recited. The land's topography becomes a sequence that holds the myth in place. Cognitive scientists call this the method of loci, a memory technique. You visualize placing items you need to remember along a familiar route. You walk that route in your mind to retrieve them. Oral cultures scaled this principle monumentally. They didn't just visualize a route, they physically walked it, and the items they placed along it were everything. The entire ecological and historical knowledge of their people. The environment became an external hard drive, a stable, massive structure, one that could outlast any individual mind. Any fragile manuscript, here's how it worked. A community has a foundational myth about how the valley was formed. The story might tell of a great serpent carving the riverbed, a sky spirit dropping stones that became mountains, a hero's tears creating springs. The key is each event is tied to a tangible feature, an immutable feature in the landscape. That oddly shaped boulder is the serpent's head. That flat-topped hill is the sky spirit's altar. That cluster of trees marks where the hero wept. To learn the story, you walk to these places. You touch the stone as you hear about the serpent. You stand on the hill as you listen to the sky spirit's tale. The sensory experience, the feel of the rock, the view from the summit, it burns the narrative into memory. But it does more. It creates a constant feedback loop between story and sight. The ritual walk isn't just a retelling, it's an inspection. When the community arrives at the spring in the story, they see its actual condition. Is it flowing strong? Is it clogged, diminished? If the spring has changed, the story might be adjusted. Subtly, in the next telling, a new line might emerge. About a time the spring slept, only to be reawakened by a prayer. The narrative adapts to the environmental reality, while the physical landmark ensures the core memory is never lost. A profound example is the Inca sect system in Cusco. The city was the center of a vast empire, but also the center of a sacred geography. Radiating out from the main temple were 41 invisible lines, called sects. Along each sect were carefully placed shrines known as huacas. A huaca could be a spring, a cave, an unusual rock, an ancient tomb. Each one had a specific myth associated with it. And each was the responsibility of a particular family, a clan, to maintain. This system was a breathtakingly complex map. It wove together social order, political structure, astronomical calendars, and ecological knowledge into one physical and narrative web. The sects organized irrigation rites based on the springs along the lines. They scheduled agricultural ceremonies based on the huacas connected to seasonal stars. To walk a sect and tend to its huacas was to perform the maintenance of the entire cosmic and social order. It externalized the culture's most vital data onto the enduring frame of the Andes Mountains. This principle reveals the ultimate resilience of the oral method. By anchoring knowledge to the land, it made the earth itself the library. You can burn a codex, you can shatter a tablet, but you cannot erase a mountain. You cannot easily destroy a sacred river. As long as the people could return to the trail, they could reboot the system. The landscape held the prompts. The ritual walk activated the memory. It shows a deep understanding that the most reliable storage device isn't made by human hands. It's the world we walk upon. Every hill and stream becomes a page, and the journey between them becomes the reading of the oldest book we have. A geologist is at Crater Lake in Oregon. Looking at sediment cores, the data shows a massive volcanic eruption about 7,700 years ago, an event that would have reshaped the continent. At the same time, an anthropologist is recording the oral history of the Klamath people. Their ancient legend tells of a great battle between Skell, the sky god, and Lau, the underworld god who lived inside a mountain. The legend says the mountain shook with fire, the sky went black, then the summit collapsed in on itself, leaving a deep, pure lake where the mountain had been. The scientific data and the poetic story are describing the same event, the formation of Crater Lake. This isn't a lucky guess, it's a validation across millennia. A single story passed from parent to child for over 300 generations. It preserved a perfect memory of a geological cataclysm. This convergence has a name. Geomythology, a term from the geologist Dorothy Vitaliano. It's the study of oral traditions that contain real memories of long-past geological events. Earthquakes, tsunamis, volcanic eruptions, meteor impacts, events so traumatic they became etched into the landscape and into the identity of the people who saw them. These stories were the only way to make sense of the unimaginable, to pass the warning forward. The examples are profound. In New Zealand, the Maori have a tradition about the fires of Tamatea. It tells of a warrior whose cooking fires were so vast they created the great crater-holding Lake Taupo. Geological evidence confirms the Taupo eruption was one of the most violent on Earth in the last 5,000 years. The oral history preserves its scale and its localized origin in a narrative form. In Japan, the legend of the fire goddess Kagetsuchi. It describes her birth scorching her mother, Izanami, who then retreats to the land of the dead. Scholars see in this a possible metaphor for the deadly nature of volcanic activity. The story encodes a truth about the environment. This land is born from fire. And that fire can bring loss. These alignments force a reevaluation. For centuries, many academic traditions saw oral histories as folklore, as imaginative stories, not credible historical sources. Geomythology bridges that gap. It shows that when a community experiences a transformative environmental event, they don't just record the facts, they weave the facts into their cosmology. They create a story that explains why it happened, what it meant, how to live in the world it left behind. The factual core remains. The mountain exploded. The sea rushed in. It stays intact within the poetic frame. This convergence does something vital. It grants oral traditions their place as legitimate data streams. Often uniquely durable, they become another layer of evidence, one that can fill gaps in the archaeological or geological record. A written chronicle from 1,000 years ago might note a year of strange weather. But an oral legend can preserve the sensory terror of the event itself, the sound of the earth groaning, the color of the ash-filled sky, the desperation of the flight to higher ground. It records the human experience of the disaster, which is a data point all its own. This partnership between story and science is rewriting histories. It suggests many of the world's most enduring myths are not fantasies but reports, highly accurate, emotionally charged reports from our deepest past. They weren't meant to be read as literal science, but they were meant to be remembered, and in that remembering they carried forward a truth that written records, lost to time, could not. The legend was the backup, a resilient, distributed backup system for planetary memory. When the science confirms the story, it isn't proving the myth. It's listening to it, finally hearing a testimony spoken into the wind for thousands of years, waiting for someone to understand the language, the scribe's quill on vellum. In a room few could enter, early writing was exclusive, priests, administrators, kings. The knowledge it captured was powerful but locked away, behind walls, behind language, behind literacy itself. Now picture a village elder under the shade of an ancient tree. The audience isn't a select few, it's everyone, men, women, children, all listening to the same story. That's the eighth principle, the democratization of knowledge access. In oral cultures, environmental wisdom wasn't hoarded, it was communal property. It had to be, everyone's survival depended on it. Historians like Walter Ong outline this divide. Early writing systems were complex, they required years of training. The materials clay, papyrus, parchment were expensive. That created a natural gatekeeper, a literate elite. The knowledge they recorded served the state. Tax records, royal decrees, religious dogma, the everyday knowledge of how to live on the land, that often existed outside the official archives. It lived in the stories told to everyone. This broad access had an effect. It meant the knowledge was constantly in use, tested, reinforced by the entire community's experience. A farmer hearing a legend about a 7-year drought wasn't just hearing a tale. He was receiving a survival manual. He would apply its lessons, planting more drought-resistant seeds the story mentioned, or deepening the well near the old, dry riverbed the story described. The legend was a tool. Every member of the community had a copy. They used it, discussed it, and in using it, they kept it sharp. This created a resilient, distributed network. Think of it like the internet before the internet, but instead of servers, the data was stored in human minds. Instead of a centralized hub, a peer-to-peer network. If one storyteller passed on, the knowledge wasn't lost. It lived in dozens, hundreds of others who had heard the same stories around different fires. The system was anti-fragile. It thrived on distribution. You see this across the Arctic. For the Inuit, navigating the sea ice is life. The ice is never static. It shifts, cracks, reforms with terrifying speed. Their vast library of hunting stories and personal accounts isn't kept in a book in a shaman's hut. It's shared openly, around communal meals, during long travels. An elder recounts the subtle signs that warned of thin ice decades ago. A hunter describes the new pattern of seal holes he observed this season. This constant, open exchange creates a collective intelligence, a real-time, crowd-sourced map of a dynamic environment. Every traveler contributes a data point. Every story updates the shared model. The knowledge isn't archived, it's applied, debated, and refined by the very people whose lives depend on its accuracy. This democratic access did more than preserve information. It embedded the environmental wisdom into the culture's muscle memory. It wasn't a subject to be studied. It was the air they breathed. The stories told to children became the instincts of the adults. This ensured the wisdom wasn't just remembered, it was lived. And in that living, it found its most secure home. You have a process you can't see, a desert moving forward year after year. How do you explain that to people who don't know climate patterns, who have never heard of soil erosion? You can't point to it, you need a different language, and oral traditions had a tool for that, metaphor. They built analogical models of the environment. A story wasn't just a report, it was a working simulation, using characters and conflicts to stand in for forces too vast or too slow to watch directly. That's where someone like George Lakoff, the linguist, becomes useful. He looked at how we use conceptual metaphors to grasp abstract things. We say an argument is a war. We talk about time as money. These aren't just phrases, they're frameworks that shape how we think, and ancient storytellers were architects of those frameworks. They took what you couldn't perceive and gave it a face, a motive, a story. So a legend about a great serpent that slowly eats the fertile land, leaving sand behind, that's not just a monster tale. It's an analogical model for desertification. The serpent's coiling movement mirrors the creeping advance of sand dunes. Its hunger is the insatiable consumption of greenery. The story makes the invisible process visible and dramatic, and most importantly, discussable. Now the community can talk about the serpent's progress this season. They can plan where to build barriers or when to move their herds based on that narrative model they all share. That metaphorical encoding allowed for communicating abstract patterns. Cause and effect, things a simple list of events could never capture. Take the sky. Many cultures have legends about celestial beings causing thunder. The Norse had Thor with his hammer, the Greeks had Zeus with his lightning, but look closer at some traditions. There are stories of sky bulls. Their bellowing is the thunder. Their fiery breath is the lightning. That might seem like simple personification, yet when tied to specific seasonal lore, it can encode precise observations. Maybe the legend says the sky bull only bellows when the wind comes from the west just before the spring rains. The story bundles it all together, the sound, the light, the wind direction, the seasonal timing, into one memorable character. It creates a predictive model. When you hear that deep rumble from the west, you know it's time to prepare for the bull's gift of rain. The modeling of seismic activity is even more direct. Tales of the earth shaking in anger, or of a giant trapped underground struggling to get free, those are perfect analogies for the buildup and release of tectonic stress. The story captures the essential experience, the sudden, violent movement, the feeling of the solid world becoming unstable, and the cause, attributed to a giant's rage, provides an explanation for something terrifying and inexplicable. More importantly, it often comes with lore. The giant gets angry if the sacred mountains are disrespected, or the earth shakes to warn of an imbalance. That attaches a moral or practical lesson to the geological fact, promoting behaviors that might, in reality, keep communities away from unstable slopes or sacred, geologically active sites. That's the genius of the metaphorical approach. It made complex environmental systems comprehensible on a human scale. A drought wasn't just a lack of rain. It was the sun god holding back his tears. A volcanic eruption wasn't just magma and gas. It was the mountain god revealing his fiery heart. These analogies transformed raw, frightening phenomena into narratives with an internal logic. They allowed a community to reason about their environment, to ask questions within the framework of the story. If the land serpent is advancing, what did we do to anger it? How can we appease it? If the sky bull is silent, what offering does it require? The story provided a shared language for diagnosing environmental change and debating responses. It fostered a communal, participatory understanding of ecological dynamics. The knowledge wasn't a secret formula locked in a temple. It was a living, breathing dialogue with the world. Modeled in the most powerful cognitive technology we've ever invented, the metaphor, a single, well-crafted story could contain the logic of an entire ecosystem, ensuring that every member of the community, from the youngest child to the oldest elder, carried a functional map of how their world worked, not as data, but as a truth they could feel and retell. 3 winters with no summer in between, that's the Fimbulwinter from Norse prophecy, the brutal prelude to Ragnarok, the end of all things. It's a myth of chilling scale, but what if that story of an endless freeze isn't just a metaphor? What if it's a memory, a cultural echo of a real climate disaster that reshaped the ancient North? Historical climatologists point to a period of intense cooling. It began in the middle of the 6th century. Tree rings from that time show stunted growth across Europe and Asia. Ice cores from Greenland have layers of volcanic sulfate. They point to not one, but several massive eruptions around the year 536. Those eruptions likely threw so much ash and aerosol into the atmosphere that they dimmed the sun. For years, temperatures plummeted, harvests failed. They call this period the Late Antique Little Ice Age. For Scandinavian societies living on the climatic edge, a shift like that wouldn't be a minor inconvenience. It would be a world-ending event. The oral tradition of the Fimbulwinter could be the encapsulation of that experience, a multi-generational trauma of cold and famine and societal fracture. Compressed into that powerful image, 3 relentless winters, the myth does more than record the weather. It records the consequence. The sagas speak of brothers fighting brothers, of kinship breaking down, the old rules crumbling from desperation, and that aligns with what archaeologists see, evidence of increased conflict, migration. The abandonment of settlements in Scandinavia during those cold centuries. The story preserved the human dimension of the disaster, the social unraveling that happens when the environment turns against you. Now compare that to the written records from continental Europe at the same time. A chronicle might tersely note a hard winter or a crop failure. Those are data points. Fragmented and dry, they don't have the narrative power to convey what it meant to live through a decade where summer never truly arrived. They can't communicate the creeping dread. The cultural dislocation, the collective memory of a time when the sun itself seemed to weaken. The Norse poetic tradition through myth captured that totality. It preserved not just the fact of the cold, but its meaning, its role as a herald of a broken world. That's the capacity of oral legend. It holds the qualitative truth of an environmental shift. The fear, the loss, the struggle for meaning under a changed sky. Where the written record offers a cryptic footnote, the spoken story offers a saga. A testament to resilience and a warning etched in ice told around the longfire for centuries after the real frost had gone. The river always went west. But this spring, it didn't. It cut a new channel through the old hunting grounds, left the village sacred crossing place high and dry. For a community whose whole calendar, whose identity is tied to that water's path, this isn't just geography. It's a cosmic rupture, a break in the world, and the question is how a culture survives that without collapsing into despair. They turn to their oldest story. The one about the river spirit, creator and trickster. In the original telling, the spirit carved the first valley with a silver spear, gave the people its bounty. Now the elders gather. They don't throw the legend out as broken. They listen to the new river's song and they adapt the frame. Maybe the spirit has grown restless, or is leading them to a new bounty they can't yet see. The story stretches to fit the new reality. This is the 9th principle, adaptive framing for cultural continuity. Oral traditions give you these flexible narrative structures. They aren't brittle scripts. They don't shatter with change. They're resilient frameworks. They can take in new environmental data without throwing away the foundational wisdom. The cultural anthropologist Jerome Brunner spoke to this. He said narrative is our primary tool for making sense of experience. Especially unexpected, disruptive experience. A legend doesn't just record what happened. It gives you a plot, a logic, a way to understand what is happening. When the river moves, the existing story about the river spirit offers a ready-made context. It tells the community this event has meaning. It's part of an ongoing relationship, not a random act from a chaotic world. This adaptive framing is the shock absorber for a culture's worldview, and this is different from factual inaccuracy. It's not about getting details wrong. It's about keeping a coherent, functioning model of the world. One that can absorb shocks and still give guidance. The old story gives the new event a home, a place in the larger tapestry, so the community isn't starting from scratch in a terrifying new landscape. They're navigating a new chapter in a very old book. They know this character, the river spirit. They understand its moods. Even this drastic action fits, however uneasily, into the relationship they've always had. It turns disorienting trauma into a manageable conflict inside a known narrative. You see this across the Pacific. Many island cultures have a foundational legend. The ancestral hero arriving by canoe from a homeland across the sea. That story is the bedrock of identity. Now, with modern sea level rise, that same narrative framework gets engaged. Community discussions aren't framed as defeat by climate change. They're framed as a new chapter in the ancestral voyage. The story gives the language, the moral courage to consider migration. We are the children of voyagers, the narrative reminds them. finding a new home isn't abandoning who we are. It's fulfilling our legacy. The core identity stays intact even as the practical reality shifts. The legend adapts to acknowledge the change while making sure the people don't lose their sense of self. This principle shows what oral tradition ultimately preserves. It's not just a gallery of environmental snapshots, it's a dynamic record of the process of human-environment interaction across time, how people interpreted change, how they folded disruption into continuity, how they used story to remain themselves in a world that would not stay still. The river's new path is a problem, but the story about the spirit who guides it is the tool. It makes the problem navigable, turns a crisis of geography into a dialogue with history. And in that dialogue, the future becomes a story they have the power to keep telling. It's more than words, that new chapter in an old book. It carries the scent of pine after a rain, the sharp, cold sound of lake ice cracking in deep winter, the gritty feel of a specific sand underfoot. Oral legends are saturated with sensory detail. And that's not decoration, it's data storage. The principle is multi-sensory encoding. A story that engages smell, sound, taste, and touch creates a richer memory trace. More durable than visual text alone, sensory ethnography shows us this, how cultures experience the world through their senses. Environmental knowledge isn't just facts. It's a full-bodied experience, and the stories that preserve it are written in the language of the senses. Think about the difference. A written record from an ancient farm might state the harvest failed for 3 years. It's a crucial fact, but an oral legend from the same hardship would describe the taste of the unripe, bitter grain, the unsettling silence of birds that had fled the parched fields, the way the dust hung in the air casting a strange yellow light. Those sensory details do more than set a scene. They carry precise ecological information. The bitter taste signals a specific stage of plant stress. The absence of birds indicates a collapse in the insect population. The color of the dust might hint at soil composition changes. The story bundles the quantitative event, the failed harvest, with the qualitative, sensory reality of living through it. This creates a complete package. One that is infinitely harder to forget. For survival-based cultures, this sensory layer was a practical manual. A Siberian Evenki story about hunting isn't just a tale of a chase. It will describe the exact crunching sound reindeer hooves make on wind-packed snow versus the soft, sinking silence of fresh powder. That sound tells the hunter the animal's speed, its direction, even its potential fatigue, its actionable intelligence woven into the narrative's fabric. Or consider stories from coastal peoples. They won't just say a storm is coming. They'll describe the precise greenish-gray hue of the clouds near the horizon, the particular way the waves begin to chop, not roll, the salty, metallic taste the wind carries. These are not poetic flourishes. They are highly accurate forecasting criteria, passed down as sensory clues within a memorable tale. Written records of the time, focused on events or quantities, routinely strip this layer away. A royal chronicle might note a severe storm that damaged ships. It will not record the sound that warned the oldest fishermen to head for shore. That lived, sensory wisdom existed almost exclusively in the oral stream. It was the difference between knowing a fact and possessing an instinct. The smell of rain on dry earth isn't just a pleasant memory. In a story, it becomes a marker. A sign that a long drought is breaking, that the hard-packed soil might soon be plantable. That knowledge, anchored by the vividness of the smell itself, becomes part of the community's reflexive understanding of their world. When you hear the legend, you don't just remember the plot. You remember the feeling of the air, and in that feeling, the environmental truth finds its most resilient home. The hero's axe fell, and then came the famine. That's the old story. A warrior, in his pride, cut down the ancient grove, the sacred trees. He needed timber for a haul. But the grove was where the forest spirits rested. Their anger was swift, the rains stopped, the soil turned to dust, his people suffered, and it's not just a punishment story. It's a system. The 10th principle shows that oral legends put environmental knowledge inside a moral frame, a sanctioning frame. It's not enough to know cutting trees causes erosion. The story gives you a sacred, terrifying reason not to do it. Compliance comes through cultural pressure, through social stigma, through the fear of supernatural retribution. For millennia, taboo and customary law were the bedrock of resource management. The expert Fickwit Burks calls this traditional ecological knowledge. Management systems. That legend about the grove isn't folklore, it's case law. It sets precedent. It creates a social contract with the land where violation brings collective consequences. That framework turned practical need into sacred duty. It preserved the data and the social mechanisms to make people live by it. You see this in the Hawaiian concept of kapu. Forbidden, sacred, a taboo. Specific fish were placed under kapu during spawning. The sanction wasn't a fine from an officer. It was woven into stories of the gods. The shark god Kamoholii, the volcano goddess Pele. To fish during kapu was to insult them directly. The community believed it would bring misfortune. Failed harvests, storms. The social pressure to comply was immense because everyone's well-being was at stake. It was a highly effective, self-policing conservation policy. One that let fish populations recover season after season for generations. In Japanese Shinto belief, the kame are spirits in natural features, an old tree, a distinctive rock, a waterfall, a mountain. These aren't just scenic, they're inhabited. To harm such a place isn't vandalism, it's a profound offense against the kame. That belief fosters an automatic reverence, a cultural reflex to protect. The forest isn't just a resource, it's a community of unseen neighbors. That framework made sustainable living a spiritual practice, a daily act of respect. Now, a written record from an ancient kingdom might decree a fine for cutting royal timber. That's a transaction, a rule from a distant authority. It lacks the moral gravity of the legend. It doesn't explain why the rule exists in the grand scheme. It doesn't connect the action to the health of the whole community, to the favor of the gods. A dry record can be ignored if the authority is weak. But the legend, living in the hearts and fears of every person, has its own enduring power. It shows how oral tradition preserved the most crucial element, the collective will to live in balance. The story provided the why, and in doing that it guaranteed the how would be remembered and obeyed long after any king's edict was forgotten. Plato told us about Atlantis, a kind of shining, advanced island kingdom. It vanished in a day and a night under the waves. For centuries, everyone's been looking for a literal city, for ruins on the seafloor, but maybe we're looking for the wrong thing. Maybe Atlantis isn't a place to find. It's a story to understand, a geomyth on a huge scale. A folk memory, something passed down by word of mouth for 1,000 years before Plato wrote it. A memory of a real coastal collapse, something traumatic. The details are too specific to just be made up. An island past the Pillars of Hercules, a circular city with rings of water and land, a sudden, catastrophic sinking. That doesn't sound like a daydream. It sounds like a report from the edge of living memory, filtered through generations of telling. Maritime archaeologists have found the foundations for memories like that. Not a circular city, but something just as telling. They map ghost landscapes all around the world's coastlines, from the last ice age when sea levels were 100 meters lower. Vast fertile plains are down there now. One of the most famous is Doggerland, a lost land that connected Britain to Europe. Hunter-gatherers lived there for millennia. Then the glaciers melted, the seas rose, slowly at first, then in sudden surges. Doggerland shrank from a continent to an island. Then, around 8,000 years ago, a catastrophic tsunami probably finished it. The land was gone, swallowed. For the people living on those shrinking shores, this wasn't a slow process. It was the end of their world, a trauma that would have been told and retold for centuries. A story of a great, fertile land lost to the hungry sea. Could the seed of Atlantis be in a memory like that, carried by generations of sailors, morphing over time, moving south into the Mediterranean? There's a more recent candidate too, more precise, the Minoan eruption of Thera, the volcano we call Santorini. Around 1600 BC, it exploded, a force that makes Krakatoa look modest. The center of the island collapsed into a huge caldera. Tsunamis radiated out across the Aegean, maybe 100 meters high. They would have devastated the coast of Crete, the heart of the Minoan civilization. Ash blotted out the sun. Their maritime empire likely never recovered. So here you have all the elements: an advanced island culture, a circular geological feature, the caldera. A sudden, violent cataclysm with sea and earthquakes. The civilization fades from history. Is it any wonder that stories of a glorious island kingdom, punished by the gods and swallowed by the sea, would persist there for centuries? Told by survivors, by traders, long before any philosopher wrote it down. This is where the contrast matters. We have Plato's account, a single, written source from the 4th century BC. He presents it as a moral parable about hubris, but he says he heard it from an Egyptian priest who spoke of events 9,000 years before. That chain, from event to Egyptian oral tradition to Greek retelling to written text, that's the signature of a geomyth. Plato's version is the snapshot, the fossil, but the life of the story, the original pulse, was in the oral traditions that swirled around the Mediterranean for 1,000 years. Widespread stories of great floods and lost lands, the Deucalion myth in Greece, the Utnapishtim story in Mesopotamia, these weren't isolated. They were part of a shared cultural memory of coastal instability. Of watching the shoreline change, the oral process explains the magnification, the idealization. Over centuries, a story about a town lost to a storm surge can become a city. A city can become a kingdom. A kingdom can become a utopian empire with impossible technology. The trauma of loss is preserved, but it gets wrapped in a narrative of former glory. It becomes a warning and a dream. This is how oral tradition preserves environmental change, not with a surveyor's precision, but with emotional truth. The core memory isn't the coordinates, it's the shock, the water where there was land, the silence where there was life. So Atlantis might be the most famous example of all. Not a sunken city of gold, but a brilliant, enduring monument built from words, a monument to the real lands we've lost and to the stories that keep their memory afloat long after the last stone has sunk. Our digital world feels permanent, but its memory is fragile. We've built the largest archive in history, and its foundations are built on sand. Hard drives fail. File formats become obsolete. Online platforms shut down. Archivists call this bit rot, the gradual decay of stored data. A photo from 20 years ago, saved on a floppy disk, is now trapped behind a wall of obsolescence. The medium we trust to hold our knowledge is, in geological terms, ephemeral. It mirrors the vulnerability of ancient libraries, but at a new, digital scale. And within that paradox, there's a parallel. The decentralized nature of the internet, or systems like blockchain, echoes the design of oral tradition. It's a network, not a single vault. Information exists in many places at once. That's the ancient principle of resilience through distribution, reborn in silicon. So the oldest human technology for preserving knowledge might hold a key to safeguarding our future. The challenge is preserving vast climate datasets, satellite imagery, ecological models for centuries. We can't assume the software to read them will exist, but we can learn from storytellers. The first lesson is narrative memorability. Raw climate data is essential, but it's not a story. It doesn't stick. Oral traditions show that to make knowledge last, it has to be woven into a narrative people care about, that they retell. Scientists and communicators are starting this translation. Turning complex projections into stories about coastal communities, migrating species, changing seasons. These aren't just reports, they're the modern myths we need to remember. The second lesson is community-based updating. Just as elders calibrated stories against the living land, we can empower local communities to become storytellers of their own environmental change. Citizen science projects monitoring bird populations, water quality, blooming flowers, they're creating a distributed, living record. When a farmer shares her observation of an earlier harvest for 10 straight years, she isn't just providing a data point. She's adding a verse to a modern songline about a warming climate. Her story carries the weight of lived experience. It makes the abstract pattern real and memorable. The third lesson points to a hybrid future. Imagine using immersive technology to create digital songlines, a virtual reality journey through a forest where the narrative of its ecological history unlocks as you move through the space. Hearing stories of different tree species, witnessing time-lapse changes of glacial retreat. This combines the spatial, mnemonic power of oral tradition with the reach and precision of digital tools. It creates a sensory, narrative map that could, in theory, be preserved across format changes by preserving the core story itself. A digital archivist might note we're good at preserving the ones and zeros, but we often lose the key, the context, the meaning, the story that makes the data matter. Oral tradition's genius was its insistence that knowledge is inseparable from its narrative and social context. Our task now is to build systems that don't just store cold data, but embed it within resilient, updatable, human-centered stories. This isn't about abandoning technology for campfire tales. It's about building a new, robust form of environmental memory, one that combines the global reach and storage of digital networks with the timeless, resilient principles of the oral world. The wisdom of the past isn't locked in the past. It's a blueprint waiting to be read for how we might remember our planet's story long into the future. The land has its own language, you just have to listen. An elder up in the Arctic said that. He said the ice doesn't just crack, it speaks. It tells you about pressure, about age, about the wind changing. For a long time, science, environmental science, it had one ear closed to that, to this whole library of knowledge held in stories, but that's shifting now. There's a movement to listen, to see that those old stories, those oral legends, they aren't just relics. They're a kind of parallel database, a rigorous one. Tested by time, and it was preserved exactly when other records, when written records, weren't there. It's about bringing a way of knowing back to life. And maybe, in doing that, finding new ways to heal things, to heal our relationship with the planet. There's a guiding idea for this from the Mi'kmaq tradition in eastern Canada. It's called Etuapmunk, two-eyed seeing. It means learning to see with one eye through the strengths of indigenous knowledge, and with the other eye through the strengths of Western science. And then using both eyes together for everyone's benefit. It's not about one replacing the other. It's a partnership, an equal one, where different ways of knowing can show you the same truth but from different angles. This idea, this philosophy, it's being championed now by groups like the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Their Commission on Policy, they're working to bridge these worlds. And the results aren't just theory, they're concrete, they save lives. In the Arctic, satellites show the sea ice thinning, becoming unpredictable, but that data, it gets depth when you add Inuit oral history. Their terminology, Inuit hunters have a rich vocabulary for sea ice, dozens of distinct types, each with its own formation, its own strength, its own hazards. Their stories, their observations passed down, constantly updated, they give you a nuanced record, a ground truth, something satellites alone can't capture. That knowledge is being put into navigation charts now, into climate models, making travel safer for everyone. In Australia, after the catastrophic fires, land managers are turning to something old. Aboriginal fire law. For tens of thousands of years, Indigenous Australians used cool burns, carefully timed. These weren't wildfires, they were surgical. The stories, the ceremonies, they encoded when and where to burn, to promote new growth for animals, to create fire breaks, to protect biodiversity. This practice, cultural burning, it's being revived now. And it's proving more effective at reducing catastrophic fuel loads than modern fire suppression, while also rejuvenating the land, honoring a cultural legacy. And in New Zealand, the work to restore polluted rivers, it's being guided by Mataranga Maori ecological knowledge. That world view sees a river not as a resource but as an ancestor. A living being with its own mori, its life force. When a river is sick, the whole community is diminished. So restoration projects now use that knowledge to set goals. Holistic ones, it's not just about chemical water quality. It's about restoring the river's ability to sustain all life, from the smallest organisms to the people who rely on it. That approach leads to different solutions, often more sustainable, more centered on community than engineering alone could be. This movement, it's not about romanticizing the past. It's about validating a system, a sophisticated, empirical system of knowledge that was always there, a system that preserved its data through narrative. Through song, through a deep, participatory relationship with place. For centuries, that database was ignored or dismissed. Now, facing these ecological crises, we're finally learning to listen. To understand that the oldest stories we have, they might hold some of the most critical keys to our shared future. The land has been speaking all along. In a language of memory, of balance, of warning, and maybe our survival now depends on finally becoming fluent. You might ask if these are just stories. Too vague, too changed by time to be useful, and that's a fair question. Historians and folklorists ask it too. Many academics warn against reading myth too literally. A legend about a sea serpent isn't a marine biology text. A flood story isn't a tide gauge. To treat them that way would miss the point. The critique is valid if we demand scientific precision from a narrative. But that's the thing, it's a different kind of precision. Oral legends preserve a specific type of data, not the exact date of a volcanic eruption, but the human experience of living through the ash fall. The long winter that followed, not the millimeter per year rise of sea level, but the collective trauma of watching a coastline disappear within living memory. They hold socio-ecological patterns, how a society fractured under a decade-long drought, the symbolic representations of large-scale events. The slow creep of a desert becomes a land serpent in a story. Not because people didn't understand erosion, but because a serpent's relentless, coiling movement was the perfect analogical model for a force too gradual to witness directly. The very elements often seen as weaknesses, the symbolism, the narrative flexibility, the moral framing, are what allowed the core environmental lessons to survive. When a culture was displaced by war or disaster, they couldn't carry clay tablets or temple archives, but they could carry the story of the Great Flood. They could sing the song of the ancestral migration. The narrative could bend to fit a new landscape, a new political reality, while retaining its essential warning. A written record from a fallen city-state is a silent, buried relic. An oral legend from that same culture is a seed. It can be replanted. It can grow in a new place, its roots finding a way to encode the environmental truths of the new home as well. This isn't about claiming oral tradition is a perfect, unaltered log. It evolved. It was shaped by human agendas and memory's fallibility. But in that evolution, it prioritized preserving what mattered most for survival and cultural continuity. The fidelity isn't to the raw geophysical numbers, It's to the meaning of the event, the impact, the lesson learned. A 1,000-year-old saga might compress 3 centuries of cooling into the image of a single, endless winter. That's not an error, it's temporal compression for narrative power, for mnemonic stickiness. It ensures the community remembers the pattern that climate can shift catastrophically, rather than forgetting a list of slightly colder years. So the goal is not to replace ice core data with epic poetry. It's to listen to them as parallel testimonies. The ice core gives us the atmospheric chemistry. The legend gives us the human fear, the societal adaptation, the cultural wound. One tells us what happened to the climate. The other tells us what that change meant for the people who lived inside it. Together, they offer a complete picture no single source could provide. The story's resilience across deep time isn't a bug in the system, it's the feature. The feature that allowed this crucial, qualitative layer of our planetary history to endure. That future research team isn't hypothetical, it's necessary. To really open up the environmental records that stories hold, you need a new collaboration. A geologist sitting next to a folklorist, a linguist listening to a community elder. The goal isn't to prove one worldview right, it's to listen for the echoes of truth that appear between them. E.O. Wilson, the biologist, called this consilience. The unity of knowledge, the idea that the world is orderly, explainable by a small number of natural laws, and that by linking facts and theory across disciplines, you create a common groundwork. For our oldest stories, that means building bridges between sciences and humanities, breaking down the academic silos that have kept these conversations apart. Here's what that looks like. The scientist brings tools: radiocarbon dating, sediment core analysis, climate modeling. They can give a probable date for a volcanic eruption. Map the timeline of a sea level rise. The humanities scholar, the folklorist, brings a deep analysis of myth variants. They trace how a core story, a flood, a fire-spitting mountain, spread across regions. Changing subtly with each telling, you overlay these maps, the geological and the narrative, and patterns emerge. A cluster of similar flood legends along a coastline submerged 8,000 years ago. Or a consistent description of rivers of fire in traditions downwind of a volcano that erupted in a specific century. The scientist provides the when and the how. The humanist, alongside the community knowledge keeper, provides the what it felt like and the why it mattered. This is the heart of fields like ethnoclimatology and historical ecology. They are built on this model. Ethnoclimatology studies how cultures perceive, predict, and respond to weather and climate. It treats oral histories not as metaphor, but as qualitative data on past climate. Historical ecology examines the long-term relationship between humans and their environments, using every source: pollen, fossils, family sagas. These fields are interdisciplinary. They recognize a core sample from a lakebed and a legend about that lake's formation are chapters from the same book. There's a powerful example from Siberia. Researchers are working with indigenous groups like the Nenets and the Evenki. Scientists document the rapid thaw of permafrost. They measure methane release, map landscape change. At the same time, they record elders' stories, narratives about lakes appearing or disappearing overnight, a phenomenon called thermocast, tales of drunken forests, trees tilting at crazy angles as the frozen ground melts. The oral histories often contain precise descriptions of these processes from decades or centuries past. They offer a baseline that instrumental records don't have. The collaboration validates the scientific observations with deep time human witness, and it honors the knowledge system that preserved those observations. Together, they build a more urgent, more complete picture of change in one of the planet's critical regions. This collaborative approach is the key to a more complete, human-centric history of Earth's environmental past. It moves beyond seeing legends as curiosities to be explained by science. It sees them as parallel lines of evidence, essential for understanding the full scope of an event. The ice core tells us the volcano erupted. The tree rings tell us the following years were cold, but only the legend can tell us the people believed the sun god was dying. That in their despair, they invented new ceremonies to plead for its return. That is data too. It's data about resilience, about meaning-making in the face of planetary shock. By weaving these threads together, the chemical, the chronological, the cultural, you don't just reconstruct an event. You recover an experience. You begin to write a history of our planet that remembers not only what changed, but how it felt to those who lived through it. And in that recovery, you might find not just answers about our past, but wisdom for our future. The land around you has its own story. It might be waiting in a name. A creek, a hill, a street. These principles aren't locked in ancient epics. They're alive in the landscape you call home. Every community holds fragments of this memory, often without knowing it. Your task is to become a listener, a geomythologist of your own backyard. Start with the names. Toponymy is a public archive. Look at a local map. Is there a bone creek? A starvation hill. These aren't random. They're stark records. Spoken records of hardship, of a time when game vanished or crops failed. A flash flood road is a permanent warning. Etched right into the community's directions, a spring hollow that's now dry tells a story of a shifting water table. These names are the first verses. The first verses of your local songline. Then listen for the stories, the smaller legends. Every town seems to have one, that local ghost story. The lady in white said to haunt a particular bend in the river. Before dismissing it as superstition, ask a different question. Why that bend? Is the current especially treacherous there? Did a flood long ago claim lives at that spot? The ghost story becomes a narrative safety marker, a way to keep children away from a dangerous place, or the tale of a mysterious light in a certain swamp. Could that be a folk memory, a memory of methane gases, of will-o'-the-wisps flickering over decomposing plant matter, marking unstable ground? These stories often encode practical knowledge. Knowledge about hazardous terrain. Reach back within your own family. Nearly every family has its weather story. The big blizzard of '78, the drought of '88. The flood that Grandpa always talked about. These aren't just anecdotes, they're personal calibrations in a generational record. They tell you what extreme events are possible in your region. They hold details official records might miss, how the community came together, where the water actually reached, which old tree fell. Your family's story is a data point. A data point in the human experience of your local climate. Now, go and look. Find the oldest tree in your local park or forest. Stand beside it. That tree is a silent witness. Its rings hold the chemical signature of past droughts, of volcanic winters, of good years and bad. But in a human sense, what has it seen? Did it provide shade for a different culture? Did it survive a fire that cleared the land? Its very presence is a story of resilience. Or find the oldest building. What local stone was it built from? A quarry that's now a park. That building material tells a story of the land's resources, of what was readily available and valued by the first settlers. This is an act of recovery. Talk to the oldest residents. Ask them not just for dates but for sensations. What did the air smell like in autumn decades ago? How did the sound of insects differ? When did they first notice the robins arriving earlier? Their memories are a living baseline, a comparison point for ecological change. Research the folklore of your area. Local historical societies have collections, old wives' tales, regional superstitions about planting and weather. These are not mere quaint sayings, they're condensed wisdom, predictive models refined by observation. By doing this, you do more than learn history. You reactivate a relationship. You begin to see the land not as a passive setting, but as an active participant. A participant in a long, ongoing story. You start to read the environment as a text. The peculiar dip in a field might be an old river meander. The line of unusual stones could be a glacial moraine. Each feature has a genesis, a reason for being there. Your landscape is whispering its past. It's been waiting for someone to ask and to understand that its stories are not just about what happened. They're about how to live here now. This is how the principles become personal. They transform from an idea about ancient cultures into a living practice. A practice of belonging. Your home ground has a saga. You just have to learn how to hear it. We started a long way back with ancient fires and ended up here in modern labs. And the whole path was mapped out in stories, the oldest ones we have. What we found is that our ancestors were environmental scientists. They watched the world closely. They were part of it. And they kept their data in the most durable system there is, the story. We went through 10 ideas, how they turned the landscape into myth, mountains as sleeping giants, rivers as gods. The generational calibration, where elders would edit the story, adding their own winters to the long winter. They used the land itself as a memory palace. And they wrapped knowledge in moral tales, so the lessons weren't just learned, they were felt. This isn't to take away from writing, it's to see more. Before writing, people had built a knowledge system, a durable one. It didn't just keep the fact of a change, it kept the human meaning, the fear of the flood. The dread of endless cold. Writing gave us dates and lists. The old stories gave us context and the wisdom for living through it. Now we face environmental changes that feel new. This old way of knowing isn't just history. It's a method, a way to see. The main lesson might be to listen. Listen to the old stories as reports. Listen to oral cultures who still talk with their land. And listen to the land itself again to read its changes as part of a story we're in. Barry Lopez said everything is held together with stories. That's what holds us together. Who we are, what we remember, how we relate to the planet, it's all narrative. Those old legends glued people to their place and their place to their past. By seeing how they worked, we get back a piece of being human, a way of knowing that's whole and resilient and wise. The campfire might be quiet now, but the stories it carried are still talking. We have to remember how to hear them.